Stauffenberg, ich konnte auch nicht warten, ob der Hitler wirklich tot war, was er angenommen hat, weil er musste lebend aus dem Führerhauptquartier rauskommen, um nach Berlin zu fliegen, um dort den Walküre-Plan zu starten und zu unterschreiben.
Having witnessed the explosion from a safe distance, Stauffenberg got word to Berlin that Adolf Hitler was dead.
When Stauffenberg arrived back from Hitler's headquarters, he saw that almost nothing had been done to get the coup going. And he marched into his superior officer's office, General Fromm, and told him that Hitler had been killed. And General Fromm didn't believe it and called Field Marshal Keitel in East Prussia to see what the situation was. And Keitel said, Hitler is alive.
Hitler and some of his staff managed to get messages through to Berlin. The conspirators not succeeded in cutting off the radio telephone links. And once these messages got through, then Fromm backpedaled.
And Fromm said, you must shoot yourself. The coup cannot take place. And Stauffenberg said, I shall do no such thing. And then Fromm said, you're under arrest. And Stauffenberg said, on the contrary, it's you who is under arrest.
After locking Fromm in a nearby office, Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators initiated Operation Valkyrie. Soon after, Major Otto Rehmer was sent to the propaganda ministry with orders to arrest Joseph Goebbels. He did not get very far.
And Rehmer said he had orders from Bendlerstraße, from the headquarters of the Home Army. And there was also information that Hitler had been killed and that the army must keep order. And Goebbels said he didn't believe that Hitler was killed and put Rehmer on the phone with Hitler. And then Hitler said, do you realize that I am alive? And Rehmer said, yes, my Führer. So Rehmer was turned around by Hitler.
Major Rehmer was persuaded by Goebbels to move his troops into the army headquarters to quash the conspiracy.
Utilizing Rehmer's newly arrived troops as a firing squad, General Fromm staged a desperate show of loyalty in order to save his own skin. At just after 11 p.m., within 12 hours of the failed assassination attempt, the general rounded up Stauffenberg along with his aide and 2 other officers and ordered them to be executed on the spot. For General Beck, the end was less than glorious.
General Beck was allowed to use his pistol to shoot himself. He fired one shot that grazed his temple, and he was not even quite unconscious, and he was allowed a second shot, but again failed to kill himself. And Fromm then ordered a corporal to give him the coup de grâce, to shoot him.
At just after midnight, in the courtyard of the Bendler block, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, his aide, First Lieutenant Werner von Heften, General Friedrich Olbricht, and Colonel Albrecht Mertz von Quernheim were executed by a firing squad. With them went the hopes and prayers of the German resistance. The bomb that went off under the conference table at Wolf's Lair had killed 3 German officers and a stenographer. Miraculously, Hitler himself sustained only minor injuries. Even more convinced of his almost divine invincibility, he was determined to round up the conspirators and crush them once and for all.
Hitler spoke on the radio himself, something that during the second half of World War II, I might add, he did very rarely.
Wenn ich heute zu Ihnen spreche, da geschieht es aus 2 Gründen. Erstens, damit Sie meine Stimme hören und wissen, dass ich selbst unverletzt und gesund bin. Zweitens, damit wir aber auch das Nähere erfahren über ein Verbrechen, das in der deutschen Geschichte seinesgleichen sucht.
For the Allies, news of the July 20th plot only served to convince them that Hitler was becoming even more isolated and that his inner circle was crumbling.
Allied propaganda put this down as an internal quarrel within the Nazi movement of no importance at all. I think to admit that this was a serious attempt to overthrow Hitler would have put a question mark over the policy of unconditional surrender.
The Allies never got into a position to act on this because before the plot, they were not aware of the extent of it. After it was too late to do something about it.
If Hitler couldn't achieve victory, he could at least seek revenge. Using Himmler's secret police, he issued orders to arrest all suspects and torture them for information.
Der Wille, aus dem Leben zu scheiden, war bei vielen, weil sie befürchteten, bei Verhören, bei Folterungen, Verräter von Freunden, Namen, ungewollt, aber eben Namen zu nennen.
Mein Vater, er hat sich am 8. November 1944 in den Morgenstunden mit einer Pistole das Leben genommen. Wir Kinder sind dort gewesen. Er ist dann in den Armen meiner Mutter gestorben. Er war nicht sofort tot. Wir Kinder sind davor bewahrt worden, unseren Vater noch einmal zu sehen. Aber natürlich war ab dem Tag eine neue Passage des Lebens beschritten. Ich bin am Tage des Todes meines Vaters geboren worden. Das heißt, wir haben das Drama dieses Opferweges selbst miterlebt und sind dadurch auch alle geprägt worden.
Mein Vater war erst in Berlin am 20. Juli und ist dann noch nach Hause, also hierher gefahren. Beim Abendbrot kam also die Gestapo an und dann ist mein Vater aufgestanden, rausgegangen in den Steinflur und der Gestapo-Mensch hat ihn gefragt, sind Sie Graf Hardenberg? Hat mein Vater gesagt, ja. Dann hat er gesagt, ich muss Sie verhaften. Hat mein Vater gesagt, ja, ich komme mit, aber ich möchte mich von meiner Familie verabschieden. Mein Vater ist in die Bibliothek hier reingegangen und hat eine Pistole, die er vorher schon bereit hatte, aus dem Schreibtisch meiner Mutter rausgeholt und hat sich zweimal ins Herz geschossen. Als er sich schoss, zweimal, gingen beide Kugeln direkt am Herz vorbei. Da wurde er ärztlich behandelt. Sie wollten ihn erstmal pflegen, weil sie ihn verhören wollten. Sie haben zu viele Menschen zu schnell umgebracht. Sie hatten niemanden mehr, den sie verhören konnten.
Among the conspirators who either committed or attempted suicide rather than be forced to name others was Henning von Treschow. On the morning of July 21st, the man who had been both the moral conscience and chief organizer of the military plot against Adolf Hitler blew himself up with a hand grenade. In the weeks and months that followed, hundreds of suspects were arrested. Many were sent to the Gestapo incarceration center on Prince Albrecht Street, where they were subjected to brutal torture and intense interrogation. Some were sent to be tried in front of the so-called People's Court.
A considerable number were brought before the courts.
Denn sie sind ja nur noch ein Häufchen Elend, das vor sich keine Achtung mehr hat.
The judge, Roland Freisler, was a fanatical Nazi.
Und werden sie hier nicht unverschämt
Freisler shouted at them, showered them with insults.
Morde? Sie sind ja ein schäbiger Lump! Brechen Sie unter der Gemeinheit! Ja oder nein? Zerbrechen Sie darunter? Präsident. Ja oder nein auf eine klare Antwort? Nein. Nein, Sie können auch nicht mehr zerbrechen. Denn Sie sind ja nur noch ein Häufchen Elend.
Some of them still managed to get in a few jibes. When Freisler shouted at one of them, you're such a traitor, you belong in hell. And the defendant shouted back, and I'll see you there soon.
The trials, which were filmed for propaganda purposes, were little more than a sham. But what followed was an end more grisly than anyone in the courtroom could have imagined. When many of the conspirators were taken to be executed at Plötzensee prison in Berlin.
The conspirators of the 20th of July 1944 were all hanged on specific orders by Hitler. They were hanged with a thin cord, slowly, in order to prolong the agony.
Even General Fromm, who had taken it upon himself to shoot Stauffenberg and 3 of the other conspirators on the night of July 20th, could not escape the Gestapo.
He was himself put on trial in March 1945, and he was convicted of cowardice. He should have been convicted of complicity, but that was a service that the judges did him, because then he was shot instead of hanged.
For the wives and families of the conspirators, there was little to do but wait and hope. Most knew little or nothing of the conspiracy, but their lives hung in the balance just the same.
My mother took my next younger brother and me aside and told us that it had been my father who had tried to kill Hitler. I was totally confused. And then my mother said he thought he had to do this for Germany. And that was a difficult thing to understand, because basically we were little Nazis, if you like. And of course there wasn't much time to talk to her, because the following night she was arrested and taken away.
In all, approximately 700 people linked to the Valkyrie plot were rounded up and arrested by the SS. More than 200 were executed. But on April 30th, 1945, with Berlin surrounded and bombarded by Allied forces, Adolf Hitler killed himself in his bunker. One week later, on May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The concentration camps were liberated. And a new nation would need to rise from the flames and ashes. World War II had claimed more than 50 million lives. For Germany, the effects of the war were devastating. Dozens of cities and towns had been bombed almost out of existence. As a further humiliation, the country was divided into 4 parts, each under the military control of one of the Allied nations.
Deep in the soul of Carl Schmitt has been planted the love of aggression and conquest. And unless that passion is uprooted, 10, 20, or 100 years hence, a new generation of Germans will find a new leader who will show them the way. How shall that be prevented?
A sound beginning has been made. This time, things are being done differently. At the end of the last war, German armies parading through Berlin. This time, the legend of German invincibility lies once and for all a shattered myth. After the last war, this was the government of Germany. Today, this is the government. We have come to Germany not as liberators, but as conquerors.
After the Second World War, the people who fought against Hitler were seen by the ordinary German as traitors. They've traited the German people, they've traited Hitler, and they were traitors against Germany. It was very hard in the German post-war society to make a new point of view for these people who were against Hitler.
Die Witwen und damit auch die Kinder bekamen keine Rente. Normalerweise war es natürlich so, dass, oder wer auch immer, ganz egal, wenn er fiel, dann hat natürlich die Ehefrau eine Rente bekommen. Das war nicht der Fall bei den Männern vom 20. Juli.
Der Widerstand wurde natürlich von vielen Menschen, Bevölkerung der Deutschen, nicht als gut angesehen, sondern im Gegenteil. Ich habe auch Verwandte gehabt, die sagten, das ist Hochverrat eben gewesen und wie kann man mitten im Krieg sich gegen den Führer wenden. Und sozusagen also alles verraten. Das musste man halt ertragen.
You have to realize that when in 1945 Germany lost the war, the liberators were the enemies. And so the Germans sticked together, and they stick together with all the old Nazis.
Ich war immer ein schlechter Schüler, sodass meine Mutter viel zu diesen Elternsprechtagen gehen musste, um mit dem Lehrer zu reden. Und ich war etwa 14 oder 15 und der Lehrer beklagte sich wieder über meine schlechten Noten. Kamen die beiden wohl ins Gespräch und dann fragte der Lehrer meine Mutter nach ihrem Mann und dann sagte meine Mutter sinngemäß, dass er nicht mehr lebt, sondern dass er eben im Zusammenhang mit dem 20. Juli umgebracht worden sei. Und darauf antwortete der Lehrer dann, ach, das ist ja eigentlich kein Wunder als Sohn eines Verräters.
Known as the widow of the man who tried to kill Adolf Hitler, Nina von Stauffenberg's life after the war was particularly challenging.
We grew up without a father, and my mother had to carry the burden of bringing us up. I think by the time my father died, my classmates had lost their fathers, lots of them already. That was nothing exceptional. Difficult to imagine today, but that was the way it was. I never doubted my father, but somehow still I couldn't understand why he'd done it. At the time, we didn't realize a fraction of everything that he'd done and they had done. That took a long time.
In 1948, Russian Premier Joseph Stalin cut off all air and road routes to West Berlin. The Cold War had begun.
The Americans and the British then organised an airlift which for many months kept West Berlin going and kept it supplied when it was surrounded by East Germany, but they still kept it going. And I think that generated a lot of sympathy for Germans.
By 1949, the situation had worsened, and Germany was ideologically divided into two separate states. The Federal Republic of Germany developed out of the US, British, and French zones, and the German Democratic Republic was created from the Soviet zone. Ironically, it would be this division that would contribute to a greater awareness and greater appreciation for the German resistance during the war.
Some senior conservative historians of the late 40s and 50s began to write about the plot and to try and vindicate them and say that look, these were people who tried to rescue Germany's honor.
Die Sachlage hat sich dadurch geändert, dass in den 50er Jahren ein Prozess stattgefunden hat, in dem geklärt wurde, ob die Widerstandskämpfer Verräter waren oder nicht. Und in diesem Prozess, der sogenannte Remer-Prozess, ist sehr klar gesagt worden, es waren keine Verräter, sondern sie haben letztlich für Deutschland gehandelt.
On September 14th, 1952, Plötzensee Prison, the place of execution for many of the July 20th conspirators, was dedicated as a memorial to the millions who suffered and died at the hands of the Nazis. For widows like Johanna Rotkins, the memorial served as a place of mourning.
Es gibt ja kein Grab. Die Leichen wurden ja sofort verbrannt und die Asche in alle Winde verstreut. Infolgedessen ist das die Stelle, wo ich meinen Mann, also wo er noch gelebt hat und gestorben ist. Ist mir noch sehr deutlich in Erinnerung. Und wie rührend es eigentlich war. Und am Anfang, wir Witzen gar nicht in der Lage waren, da überhaupt reinzugehen und sich da hinzustellen. Wir das aber gelernt haben, viele von uns, ich glaube fast alle.
Der 20. Juli 1944 war das erste sichtbare, weithin wirkende Fanal, das der Welt zeigte, dass in Deutschland der Wille zur Freiheit, der Wille zum eigenen Leben nicht untergegangen war.
Less than 1 year later, on July 20th, 1953, in the courtyard of the Bendler Block, Berlin's mayor, Ernst Reuter, unveiled a bronze statue of a nude man with his hands bound, symbolizing Germany's struggle under the Nazis.
Well, I was very young there. It was quite exciting to see all these people. Some of the actual survivors of the plot, and then so many people that knew my father. It is a history that wasn't always easy to accept for everyone in Germany, but I've never had any doubt that he was a patriot, and he wanted to do the best for Germany.
But could the German public's opinion of the conspirators and their families really change? And just how willing would the world be to embrace their former enemies as true friends and allies?
Herr Generaloberst?
Sie haben den Walküre-Befehl gegeben?
Jawohl, Herr Generaloberst.
Ohne meine Einwilligung? Sie sind verhaftet. Das Weitere wird sich finden.
Herr Generaloberst, ich selbst habe die Bombe gezündet. Ich habe sie unmittelbar neben Hitler platziert. Er kann nicht mit dem Leben davongekommen sein.
In 1955, 2 films were released in West Germany that dramatized the July 20th plot. The first, directed by legendary German filmmaker G.W. Pabst, starred Bernhard Wicki as Stauffenberg and offered a fairly accurate, if somewhat austere, account.
Das Wachregiment ist alarmiert worden. Ich will wissen, wer die Befehle dazu gegeben hat.
Das Wachregiment marschiert aufgrund der Walküre-Befehle.
Wieso Walküre? Ich muss sofort Fromm sprechen. Was geht hier vor? Wo ist Fromm?
Sie müssen schon mit mir Vorlieb nehmen. Ich bin an Fromms Stelle getreten.
Auf wessen Anordnung?
Auf Anordnung von Generaloberst Beck.
Dann nehmen Sie zur Kenntnis, dass ich mich weigere, Ihre Befehle zu befolgen, Herr Höppner.
Seien Sie doch vernünftig. Die Truppe marschiert bereits. Worum es hier geht,
ist Hochverrat.
The second production, sparsely titled The 20th of July, premiered within weeks of Pabst film. Directed by Dr. Falk Harnack, a resistance member himself, it offered a somewhat more complex interpretation, one which attempted to examine the motives of the conspirators.
Meine Herren, ich glaube, wir geraten schon wieder ins Theoretisieren. Das haben wir jetzt lange genug getan. Die militärische Lage nach Stalingrad ist mehr als ernst. Was wir brauchen, ist die befreiende Tat.
Sehr richtig. Die illegalen Arbeitergruppen sind von den Generalen bitter enttäuscht. Jahr für Jahr warten sie vergebens auf eine Aktion. Es muss endlich etwas geschehen.
Das ist eine gerechte Forderung, Herr Köfer. Wenn wir auch wenige sind, so müssen wir doch die große Fahrt in eine bessere Zukunft beginnen. Sie wird teilweise ein rasendes Tempo annehmen. Es ist aber notwendig, dass sich in Deutschland etwas ganz Neues findet. Ein neuer Kern, der zwischen Ost und West ein Leben nach unserem Sinne ermöglicht.
Perhaps not coincidentally, it was also in 1955 that West Germany joined NATO. It was a positive step in the divided country's post-war rehabilitation.
With the outbreak of the Korean War, it became a matter of interest to the Western powers, particularly America, that Germany contribute to the defense of Europe. The German army could not simply be reconstituted as it had existed until 1945. It needed an honorable tradition. And where to find an honorable tradition? The answer was the resistance. Officers in the new army had to answer questions about how they saw the resistance, and if they refused to accept that the conspirators had honorable motives, they were generally ineligible for officers' commissions.
Berthold von Stauffenberg, Klaus von Stauffenberg's oldest son, was one of the first to join the new West German army as an officer.
I knew, of course, that I had to live with my father's memory, and that I would be asked about him, that I would be compared with him as one of the top officers amongst his contemporaries. My father's contemporary would look at me and, is he the same as his father, you know? And that's a bit uncomfortable at times and unnerving. But I survived that, as you see.
In 1961, the Soviets erected a concrete wall through Berlin to divide their eastern side from the west to stop the border crossing. But as one wall went up, another came down, as public opinion about the resistors continued to change.
In the late 60s and 70s, Social Democrats came to power under Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, and there was a new atmosphere of a much more critical view of the German past, and particularly of the Nazi past.
But as much as the German public had come to embrace the members of the German military and civilian resistance as patriots, there was still a reluctance to call them heroes.
The German people, since 1945, have justifiably been very wary of heroes. Nazi Germany was a state and a culture which glorified heroes, made heroes out of almost everybody. Of course, with the ultimate hero being Adolf Hitler.
Ich bin deshalb vorsichtig mit dem Wort Held, weil man Gefahr läuft, dass man vielleicht einige dabei vergisst. Und dass man Gefahr läuft, nur einige wenige zu nennen, die immer wieder genannt werden und dabei andere nicht berücksichtigt.
I'm sure my father considered himself pretty ordinary. He wasn't Superman, he wasn't the hero.
In 1987, in what would prove to be the waning days of the Cold War, U.S. President Ronald Reagan made a monumental speech at the Berlin Wall.
If you seek peace,
if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Two years later, the wall was finally torn down. It was the first step toward a reunification of Germany. It also sparked a new kind of German national identity.
There was a tremendous wave of enthusiasm and pride in 2006 when Germany hosted the World Cup, and everything went well. You could see German flags everywhere.
Plötzlich läuft die Leute mit der eigenen Fahne durch die Straße und sogar stolz Deutschland, Deutschland ruft. Und dass es viele Männer und auch Frauen gegeben hat, die stolz einen Ring um den Arm trugen mit den Farben von Deutschland. Das war zum ersten Mal ein Signal für die Deutschen, wir sind wieder wer.
After his trip to Berlin in 2002, screenwriter Christopher McQuarrie brought the idea of a feature film based on the July 20th plot to his friend, director Bryan Singer. The two had previously collaborated on Singer's first feature film, Public Access, and on the highly acclaimed suspense thriller, The Usual Suspects.
Chris and I are great friends. We've known each other since we were kids. We made World War II films in my backyard. Growing up Jewish, it's interesting. For me, it was very important to understand the development of the Reich and to understand how that came to be. I think my fascination with the Second World War began with a film I did years ago called Apt Pupil. And I knew that not all Germans were necessarily Nazis. It would be devastating to imagine that the whole of a people could be completely involved with mass murder and such hate.
After reading McQuarrie's script, Singer signed on to direct, excited by the prospect of shedding new light on a little-known chapter in World War II history. In March of 2007, the filmmakers secured financing for the project, now titled Valkyrie, from United Artists. They also received a commitment from actor Tom Cruise to play the leading role of Klaus von Stauffenberg.
There was not a conscious effort to say we're going to make a story about Klaus von Stauffenberg. But Stauffenberg is far and away the central character of the drama on July 20th, not only because he delivered the bomb, but because what he was responsible for doing after the delivery of the bomb. He's a character that takes you through the entire conspiracy.
As the production fell into place, the filmmakers decided to photograph the period exteriors on location in Berlin.
The nice thing about Berlin is that a lot of the buildings that were there during World War II actually exist, and it gives you sort of this authentic feel, and you know, the key to this whole thing was being as authentic as possible.
More than anything else, you shoot in Berlin because this is where the events took place. The city is haunted by so many ghosts, and there's so much about Berlin that still holds on to the war.
On July 19, 2007, cameras rolled for the first time on Valkyrie.
Pause! Take one more.
The production was scheduled to shoot for 15 weeks and featured an international cast of acclaimed actors, which included Kenneth Branagh as General Henning von Tresckow, Tom Wilkinson as General Friedrich Fromm, and Terence Stamp as General Ludwig Beck. For the filmmakers, accuracy and integrity were key objectives.
Tighter lens on Kretz, and then behind the shoulder.
Brian wants everything to be as accurate as possible, which we wanted as well. In certain cases, we had to combine characters, compress time and events, but we wouldn't make a change like that unless it serviced the story and allowed us to get the spirit of what was actually happening. The truth is better than anything you could ever make up.
These men tried to kill one of the most evil people who ever lived so that they could save their country, save Europe, and save the world. And so we focused on July 20th and the events of July 20th as the thing we wanted to tell. The story itself is so dramatic and so rich and so real. Why wouldn't you tell the story as truthfully as you possibly could?
We were guests of Germany while we were there.
Great. Nice to meet you. Very nice to meet you.
We got so much support from these people. One day while we were shooting, this woman walked onto set and she broke out a photo album and showed pictures of, you know, Lieutenant von Haeften and General Ulbricht, who'd been at parties at this house. And this had been her family home. I called a florist in Berlin. I was sending flowers to somebody, and the girl I spoke with told me her name was von Tresco. And I said, oh, like Henning von Tresco. And she said, well, yeah, it's actually, you know, he's, you know, my grandfather. It's amazing, and it really opens your eyes to realize they had to do what they did, and what they did really mattered and made a difference.
When the time came to film the emotional climax at the Bendler block, the seasoned cast and crew were unprepared for just how emotional the experience would be.
It didn't hit me till that moment how important it was to film in that location. This journey had come in some way to a full circle. We had other authentic locations, but this one, and this is it.
After researching this subject matter for so many years, I didn't realize how emotional it would be to shoot at the Bendler block and to shoot the conspirators' execution. Before we started rolling, the whole cast and crew stood around the courtyard. Chris read a letter from one of the conspirators to his family.
Perhaps there will yet come a time that will judge us not as scoundrels, but as prophets and patriots. That this wondrous call may give honor to God is my fervent prayer.
It's a very personal film for all of us involved, and it is a great honor for me to play this character, to represent the spirit of this man. They had hope for the future and the beauty and brilliance of this country.
It's a very sensitive scene in history, and we're shooting at a place where it occurred. If you could grace this place with a minute of silence, that would be very much appreciated.
To be there in the place where this really happened, this moment of silence was just incredibly moving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And action on the vehicle!
For Germany, it's one of the stories of World War II that they can be proud of. We were there to make a movie that told the story in as respectful a way as possible. Not only for the German people, who know the story very well, but for the rest of the world who do not.
Also der 20. Juli 1944, denke ich, ist in der deutschen Geschichte wichtig, weil er, ich denke, moralisch das deutsche Volk in gewisser Weise gerettet hat.
Es sollte vielleicht ein gewisser Stolz sich entwickeln, aber so ein Stolz, dass man immer noch sagt, wir akzeptieren die Vergangenheit, die wir hatten, mit der haben wir uns beschäftigt, aber ich weiß jetzt nicht, ob man genau sagen darf, ich bin stolz, Deutscher zu sein.
Deutschland kann stolz sein darauf, dass sich wirklich noch da ein Widerstand geregt hat. Und wenn das geglückt wäre, wären Millionen von Toten uns erspart geblieben.
Each year, on the anniversary of the July 20th plot, crowds gather at the Platzensee Memorial Center and at the German Resistance Memorial in the courtyard of the Bentler Block. For some, it is out of respect. For others, it is an act of duty. Of responsibility to history.
Ich halte den 20. Juli für einen der 10 bedeutendsten Daten der deutschen Geschichte aus dem 20. Jahrhundert, weil er einer der ganz wenigen Anknüpfungspunkte ist, um auch während des Dritten Reiches oder durch das Dritte Reich hindurch einen, ich würde sagen, einen unzerstörbaren Kern von Humanität, den es in Deutschland gegeben hat, zum Ausdruck zu bringen. Das ist auch den Nazis nicht gelungen, ganz zu zerstören. Das Naziregime und der Holocaust und der Zweite Weltkrieg, die werden immer eine Wunde bleiben, die vielleicht vernarbt, aber die mit Sicherheit immer schmerzen wird. Das wird auch im emotionalen Gedächtnis lange Zeit bleiben. Ich finde, dass das Land dabei ist, eine ganz gute Balance zu finden. Also in den Spiegel schauen zu können und den Blick aushalten zu können.
In vielleicht 20 Jahren wird es niemand mehr geben, der aus persönlicher Erfahrung von dieser Zeit berichten kann. Aber wir müssen die Erinnerung an den Nationalsozialismus und an den Widerstand gegen den Nationalsozialismus wachhalten. Das halte ich für ganz wichtig, weil man so viel lernen kann aus der Geschichte.
Ich würde behaupten wollen, dass es in den letzten 30 Jahren großer Anstrengungen bedurft hat, um dem deutschen Widerstand zu der Anerkennung zu verhelfen, die wir heute in der politischen Öffentlichkeit feststellen können. Insoweit hat der Bundespräsident der Bundesrepublik Deutschland, Theodor Heuss, immer recht gehabt. Das Vermächtnis ist uns übergeben, der Auftrag ist noch nicht erfüllt.
On July 20th, 1944, a few hundred German citizens risked everything in order to prove that there were still people of honor in their native land. In a desperate attempt to save their nation and to spare the lives of countless others, they gave their lives. To some, the plot may have seemed a failure, but perhaps more than 6 decades later, it can be considered a success, one more profound than even those involved could have ever imagined.